Hello and welcome to this week's Property Matters, the show that brings global trends to an Irish audience to shape your knowledge of the industry. You can contact us on Twitter at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. Your host today is myself, Carol Tallon, and we'll just take a quick look at some of the big stories from the week. First of all, according to the Irish Independent this week, annual mortgage switch savings have now reached €3,400 per year, meaning that the home loans gap has now widened by almost €900 in the last year. Also, there's been a spike in planning permissions for apartments, according to new figures from the CSO. The level of planning permissions granted for apartments jumped by more than 150% to almost 4,700 in the second quarter of the year. This increase comes on the back of an overhaul to apartment planning guidelines in March 2018, which obviously made it more economic for builders to build. Also, planning permissions were granted for a total of 4,936 houses during the same period, representing a 156% increase in apartments, but 0.3% decrease in house units. Also, German asset manager Wealthcourt reported to beaten off rivals to clinch a deal on the Reflector building, which hit the market earlier this year, asking 155 million. We'll bring more on that when we have it. Dublin City Council is planning to open Dublin libraries 14 hours a day, 365 days a year with a new automated system. We look forward to that. Finally, an independent review is to get underway into the model of construction favoured by the Department of Education for new houses, following controversy over the structural safety of dozens of new buildings. Minister for Education Joe McHugh said the review would examine the experiences of other countries that are using the department's design and build model of school construction, which is a fast-tracked construction model that involves prefabrication of some materials off-site. This review rises from a commitment given by Minister McHugh after structural assessments last year raised concerns over the safety of dozens of schools constructed by Western Building Systems. This international review is likely to be a precursor to a wider independent review of the department's design and build programme across the state. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that. So our first guest in studio today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Alan Hore, founding director of CitA, the Construction IT Alliance. Alan, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Carol. Delighted to be here.
So thank you again. What is CitA exactly, the Construction IT Alliance?
Well, I suppose it's a network, it's a community, it's a group of people who have a particular interest in digital, in construction. It crosses all boundaries of the profession, all stakeholders, whether it's clients, designers, contractors, educators, students, policymakers. So really the whole gambit, really, So the whole, I suppose the concept lies under the word alliance, yeah. And we're actually celebrating 20 years this year.
Which is phenomenal, because absolutely. I don't know, were people aware of the drive to the drive for digital in construction 20 years ago?
Yeah, well, actually, if we go back to 1999 when it all started, I suppose it was known at that time as the sort of the .com boom era, and actually in DIT Bolton Street as it was then, obviously now it's TU Dublin. We had a number of innovations there, and one of them was a company called Build Online, which actually spun out of DIT, became very successful, and within 4 years, it was really a product that was used right across the world. And at that time, there was a group of academics, myself, there was Louis Gunnigan, who's now based up in Grange-Gorman, and Ken Thomas in Waterford, had this idea of coming together, forming an alliance of organisations that looked at this. At the time, I suppose we were doing some research into the space, and there was a similar initiative in the United Kingdom called the Construction IT Centre in the University of Salford. And at the time, I remember our director, John Ratcliffe, in the college, he encouraged us to partake in the UK initiative and the UK network, and as a result of that, really we formed our own. So a lot of companies like, well, formerly I suppose Bruce Shaw, John Siskinson, and a number of other larger contractors, helped us make the alliance happen. And on the 19th of September, 1999, we had our first event.
Oh, so you're actually coming up to your 20-year anniversary.
Absolutely, 20. It was all over LinkedIn this week, so 20 years, absolutely. And we've seen a lot of change then, but one of the things is there's a huge amount of innovation going on in construction projects right across Ireland.
Yeah. I suppose my mind is blown that this has been going on for 20 years, because we look at some of the innovation that's happening now, and I suppose like every generation we like to think that we invented innovation and of course that's not the reality. So yes, there's been a lot of change over that 20 years, but given the marketplace at the time in 1999, there's been obviously extreme highs, extreme lows. So how did CitA, how did you help your members through that period?
Or I suppose to be honest, as well, like any organisation, it starts as a seed, as an idea. In this instance, it was a research project. So back in '99, we had one major event a year. We used to run events maybe in May and November each year. And in fairness to the college, I suppose at the time, they were supporting us and encouraging us, and people were coming to the college. But in 2005, we became incorporated, because at that time, once the network had grown, it's now grown to in excess of 300 subscribing members. At that time, we started to bid for research funding. We started to run larger events, and also we needed to sort of from a legal perspective be more self-sustaining. So at that stage, we exited from the college and we became a company not for profit. But the one thing that we've seen over the years is that, I suppose the one thing Irish building is famous for is building great buildings, whether it's across the world, in the UK, and indeed in Ireland. And I think now more than ever, the idea of the alliance and the idea of having an independent voice that looks sort of from an independent perspective on the range of technologies available, having that sort of view independently is really what the industry is looking for. That independent advice, that support that we can give them through our events, through our education programs, and through our research.
And I suppose I'm thinking back to at the time, in the origins, and certainly in the early, even in the first decade, there wasn't the same proliferation of social media and online digital tools and online resources. So were you accessing Irish resources? Were you looking at what was happening, best practice overseas? Where were you getting?
Well, I suppose the predominant focus back then was propensity for the industry to, I suppose, people that work in the industry would see it as a very fragmented industry. Most contracts are on different sites, different companies are working together. So it's a very challenging industry to digitise, unlike, say, the manufacturing industry. But back then, I suppose, the focus was a lot more on, I suppose, removing the paper-based processes from it.
Yeah.
So I suppose we had things like e-commerce coming to the fore, and so on and so forth. But now, I suppose, we're talking more about using, intelligent models. We're looking using IoT. All sorts of other range of technologies. I suppose even blockchain now would be a technology that's been looked at,
particularly for construction contracts. Yeah.
So I suppose it's been organic,
yeah,
if that's the right word, as we move through those two decades. But now we can see, a lot of off-site manufacturing. And of course, that requires sophisticated design tools in designing buildings, coordinating those buildings, and of course the concept today of a digital twin. That, in many industries, whether it's the automotive industry, the aeronautical industry, or even the general manufacturing industry, products are generally built digitally first. And they're stress tested in the design house before they go to site. And that's really where the next stage is. That before we go to site, that time is taken to design buildings correctly and to coordinate them correctly, so we don't have the delay and disruption that we maybe see on certain projects, that we're currently running.
Right, and then in terms of benchmarking where the Irish industry is, do we have any idea on a global scale where Ireland sits in terms of innovation and embracing digital technologies?
Well, I know that the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform recently issued a report called the Build Report, which really placed Ireland lower down in the pecking order from the point of view of our productivity levels in construction. And I know the government and the department have commissioned now a report on that to identify the causes for the relatively poor productivity levels in construction and what policies and procedures could be put in place to support that. So the sort of things they're talking about is maybe a new centre of excellence for construction. I suppose since, for example, on Forest Prohibitor was closed a number of years ago, we don't have a research centre for the industry, and that's something that most other industries have.
Yes.
So we need that. We also need. In recent years we had a new roadmap published for digital transition for the Irish construction industry. That was published in 2017, but we haven't seen that action followed through. But I'd be confident that that will come.
Actually, you might just take a few moments to talk us through that, because it's something we've referenced a few times here on the show when we've had guests in, and we have looked back at that document. But you might just explain for our audience what exactly that is.
I was involved as the principal researcher on the BIM Innovation Capability Programme for Ireland. We were very fortunate that TU Dublin were successful in that bid. So it's a very simplistic approach we took. We looked right across the world at 27 jurisdictions actually, and what they were doing in other countries in this space. And I suppose we naturally kind of gravitated towards the Commonwealth countries, the UK, because that's where our industry kind of stemmed from, I suppose, how we organise ourselves. But four very simple pillars. And you could actually apply this to any business working in the built environment engineering sector. Number one, for a company to be successful in working with digital, they need leadership. They need the leadership piece. They need someone to drive the digital agenda within the business. Second thing is they need to educate their people. So training education is very important. The third pillar would be standards. For example, we're all aware of ISO, and of course in the last 12 months or so, ISO have published a new international standard for information management for construction. So companies now need to become certified in ISO 19650, and actually NSAI are rolling out their support program for companies to get that certification. So leadership, education, standards, and above all procurement. So if you're procuring, if you're a government agency and you're procuring, you mentioned about the report, mentioned actually by the Department of Education and Science. I know they have particular interest in design and build as a preferred procurement option for future schools. But also procuring digitally. Even today now I was with a major contractor area this morning, and they were talking about their problem with the paperwork system, and even getting their purchase orders and delivery notes and their invoices to match. It's a real problem. So what they need to try and do there is completely automate that process with their larger suppliers. So 4 pillars, any company could apply it to their business.
Okay. That makes infinite sense. And just for anybody listening in that wants to get more information on that, do you have details on your website?
Absolutely, we have details on the website. Yes, yeah.
Great, thank you. The website is
CITA.ie. I can forward that.
Perfect. CITA.ie for anybody who wants to just delve a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned there BIM, and I know that there's a big event coming up.
Yes, we're having, I suppose we all look back at 2013 when that great initiative of the government to have the gathering. The idea of sort of, I suppose, encouraging diaspora to come home and to celebrate their I suppose their nationhood. And at that time, one of our directors, Ralph Montague, who would be very vocal in this space, came up with the idea of the BIM Gathering. So our first BIM Gathering was in 2013 in the Guinness Storehouse. It was a wonderful success. We had 15, 17, and now we're in 19. I suppose what's different about 2019 this year is for the first time we're moving the event from Dublin to Galway.
Why is that?
Well, mainly because I'm from Galway, but besides that...
that's reason enough.
Besides that, I suppose it's a strategy the Alliance have in that there's, I suppose, one of the things that the roadmap talks about, particularly in the leadership module, is the need for a network of regional activities in the space. So we actually have 7 regions in Ireland, look right down the western coast and the south. So the idea would be to try and, and we have champions. I spoke to one of our Western champions only a few hours ago about the event. And, so we've 260 people registered, which is great. So what we're going to be hearing, I suppose, at the gathering is local messages, but also international messages. So we have local TD, I suppose Sean Canning will be opening the conference. And we're also hearing from RPS Group. Jerry Carty will be giving an opening address, and we'll also have some international speakers. We have Jan Saar from the Estonian government. The Estonian government, I suppose, would be one of the leaders in digital across the world. They're well known and would be very highly ranked as a nation of digital native, I suppose, people, and they'll be presenting their new digital platform to support their construction industry. And of course that's so timely for Ireland because we also are looking at developing the same platform here. So
how would that platform work?
Well, the big issue with, I suppose, trying to get I suppose if we talk about building information modelling, what is it? I suppose it's a new way of designing, coordinating, managing construction projects using model information instead of flat 2D design information. So what you do is you design a model, and then you coordinate it so that everything works on site. So if you can imagine, if you want to try and get a really, I suppose, smart government who are procuring and building, whether it's infrastructure, schools, whatever, they need to also have leaders. They need to educate their people within the government, and also they need to use international standards. So the idea that there would be a platform for state agencies, that they could literally enter this platform and they could be able to download the various templates, guidelines, and so on. That
for procurement,
for procurement or for design. So, for example, if you take the situation of a school project, you could well have a generic BIM exemplar project built on the platform, so fully compliant with the building regulations, NZEB and all that, and that could be a guide that the designers within that organisation could look at as a reference point.
Okay.
So really, it's also a way of encouraging, I suppose, the designers, the constructors who work for those government agencies to coordinate and transfer data in a particular way.
Okay. Is BIM mandatory on PPP projects in Ireland?
It is. It has been mandated on a number of projects in Ireland. For example, our own project in Grange Gorman.
But that's a huge project.
That would be a huge project, and of course, there's been a number of school bundle projects that where it's being used. There is a strategy for mandating BIM in the public sector that has been sort of stratified and developed by the Office of Government Procurement, and the intention is to roll that out.
Okay. Is that the situation in the UK?
No, the UK is slightly different. The UK, I suppose, it would be fair to say that the UK are the real innovators here. Despite Brexit, they have really taken a leadership role in this space. They were the first country to mandate BIM globally, and in 2016 on capital funded projects, but it was kind of somewhat restricted on the type of projects. But they would have had a UK BIM task group, and really it was down to the fact that there was a vision that the government of the UK saw at that time. They funded a UK BIM task group. They implemented the roadmap, the mandate, and now really they're starting to see the benefits of that.
Okay, but that didn't come easy. I do recall reading, I think it was a 2015 or 2016 report by Mark Farmer of Cast Consultancy, Modernise or Die.
Yes.
There was a very stark call to innovation for the industry there. Has the Irish industry gotten that yet?
I think the one thing if you were to ask me, to give you a percentage of the industry that are using BIM, I'd say it's quite a low level. Obviously, the tier 1 companies are getting on with it, and actually, companies like, for example, Multiplex, who will be speaking now next week in Galway, they have a model first approach. I would suggest that perhaps some of our larger tier 1 contractors, without naming them, would also have will also work from a model first approach, because they see the benefits themselves. So even on a simplistic level, if they're building on a traditional architect-led project, they might well take the view, you know what, we will actually create this information ourselves digitally, and we will so we can coordinate it much more efficiently on site. Of course, the real benefit comes when the model has a contractual basis, that it's a contractual requirement, and not only does the contractor have to build, but also they have to hand over an asset-rich model that the client can use then for facility management purposes. That's the real benefit, the downstream benefit.
And I presume all of this is going to be discussed, and maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into it at the gathering?
Yes, to an extent. I mean, I suppose the theme, each of the gatherings has a particular theme. The theme for this year is delivering better project outcomes. So better project outcomes would be on time, on budget, and to the quality that's required. So that's the kind of the brief that we give all our speakers. So both our keynote speakers and the other 48 speakers that will be at the event have that brief to work with, you know.
Very good. And I understand you've 260 attendees confirmed.
260 confirmed.
Have you spaces left for people who are late to the party?
Absolutely. Please come along. And actually, we'd love to see more students come along. I think we have a special rate for the students. And, you know, it's a real time to see the future and what's ahead of us in our industry.
That's a great point. Thank you so much. Where can people find information on the event?
On the www.cita.ie website, and also we're on all social media platforms.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Alan Hore, Founding Director of CitA. Thank you so much for being with us today. Stay tuned after the break and we'll be joined by Arthur O'Brien, Managing Director of C&W O'Brien Architects, and Barry Ward, Fine Gael, Local Councillor with Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council.
Broadcasting from the Dundrum Town Centre, this is Dublin South FM.
Hi folks, it's Paddy Cunningham here, letting you know that you can join me each Tuesday evening for a brand new country music show right here on Dublin South FM. Each Tuesday from 8 p.m, Country Roads is going to bring you the best in Irish and American country music, looking at that week's country chart and a featured artist. So why not join me each Tuesday evening from 8 p.m. right here on Dublin South FM for Country Roads.
The best in Irish and American country music on Dublin South FM with Paddy Cunningham.
Greetings 60s fans, it's Jim and Isabel here. Do you remember Opal Fruits, the Rainbow Cafe or the Poolsman? Did you listen to the latest pop record on Radio Caroline or Radio Luxembourg? Well, whether the answer is yes or no, Echoes of the Jukebox puts you right at the heart of the sights and the sounds of the 60s. Armed with a stack of singles, we invite you to join us on Echoes of the Jukebox right here on Dublin South FM, Wednesdays 2 to 3. The Wurlitzer's humming. We'll see you there, gang.
Sweet, sweet memories you gave me.
Hello, Martha Lynham here. Why not tune into Memory Lane, a programme for our senior citizens every Tuesday at 4? Or listen back on the podcast section of the Dublin South FM website. We'll be taking a nostalgic trip down memory lane with a mix of history, trivia, some golden oldie music and a little bit of banter. That's Memory Lane, Tuesdays at 4 on Dublin South FM.
Memories are made of this.
93.9 Dublin South FM.
Okay, welcome back to Property Matters here on Dublin South FM with myself, Carol Talon. You can contact us on Twitter at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. As mentioned before the break, in studio with us now we have Arthur O'Brien, Managing Director of C&W O'Brien Architects, and Barry Ward, Fine Gael, Local Councillor of Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council. Gentlemen, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Carol.
So today we decided to do something a little bit different. Generally we bring our guests in one at a time, but today I wanted to have a conversation maybe about what's happening in terms of planning. There's been a lot of criticism. You might have heard earlier on in the break that there's a record number of planning approvals granted for apartments. Approvals are up in the second quarter of this year, up 156%. So I think this is a number of them came under the fast track system, which has been quite controversial for some of the local councillors. Mm-hmm. So Barry, we might start with you and talk. You've shared some views about the fast track process, and you might tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, Carol, I'm not in favour of it, to be honest with you. I understand why it's happened, and in fairness to the Minister and the Department, they are looking to get as many approvals done, exactly as you see in the paper now, with a view to getting boots on site, buildings built, homes completed so that people can move into them, and that's understandable in the context that we're aware of the housing crisis. However, the problem that I have with it is twofold. Firstly, it removes any democratic element from the planning process. Now, since the year 2000, when the Planning and Development Act passed, planning powers have been removed from councillors, so we have no say whatsoever in them anyway. However, the planners who work for the council are still accountable to us, and we can still ask questions. We still set the parameters within the development plan, etc. Now you have a situation where certain types of development above a certain size go directly to An Bord Pleanala, so they bypass the council. So
are these the strategic housing or
exactly.
100 units?
More than 100 units, yeah, which has the unintended byproduct of a situation where I understand developers are taking what had been maybe 60 apartments that were 2 beds, let's say, and making them all into 1 bed so that they get over that threshold. Now, I don't have any specific examples of that, but I'm told that's happening. But the upshot of it is that the council is totally bypassed. So you no longer have a situation where the local knowledge that comes with a planner in Laoghaire-Rathdown, who might know the site or who would certainly visit the site, all of that is lost. And that application goes directly to An Bord Pleanala. So you have this central body, and it's another centralisation of power, which I'm opposed to, which hasn't got the local knowledge, which is making the decision. And I think that's a retrograde step. I don't believe it significantly speeds up the process. And I think it loses something by virtue of the fact that it doesn't have that democratic element locally, or the knowledge locally. And then there's also issues with appeals, for example. There isn't an appeal mechanism from An Bord Pleanala. There is essentially, you can judicially review it to the High Court if there's a problem with the way the decision was made. But normally, in the way most people are familiar with, you make your application to the local authority grants or refuses, and if somebody has a problem with the decision made as opposed to the manner in which the decision was made, it can be appealed to An Bord Pleanala. But the second issue is that An Bord Pleanala now is overrun. They don't have the resources to deal with the number of applications they have to deal with, which is causing a delay in the rendering of decisions, and that's also problematic for people who want to build houses and get into them.
Okay, and I'm sure any delays would be problematic. Arthur, your firm, I'm sure, are dealing with a large number of planning applications. What's your experience of the process?
I think the process is good. It's a welcome change in terms of the time frame that it takes to get an application through. I don't think it's fair to say that it usurps the democratic process. I mean, the zoning plans and the development plans are created by the local authorities and voted on by the local councils, and there's a lot of public consultation in that process. And then there's a guideline in terms of development plan of what we can and can't do. There's certainly a mix of 1, 2s and 3 bedrooms set out clearly in a lot of the development plans, if not all the development plans, and that's what we have to abide by. And when we're building apartments, it's quite specific about the number of 1, 2s and 3 beds. I think what you might be referring to is some of the relaxations for some of the different types of housing stock that we've got now, residential stock, and that's if people are living permanently in a house, the standards should be higher. If people are not living permanently in a house, then I think applying long-term residential standards is, I think, needs to be considered more, and I think that's what's happening. So I don't see that, and in that process we have to go to the local planners first. That's the first step in the SHD process. We visit them, we state our case, we talk about our units, our development, our design. And we take on board their opinion, and sometimes we go back several times to the local authority, and before we go into An Bord Pleanala, and generally we like to go forward with a positive result from the local authority before we go to An Bord Pleanala. So I'm not sure that the democratic process has been usurped in any way whatsoever. I certainly am aware of that feeling of that happening but I'm not sure it's.
Well, the first aspect of that, if I may, is I can't see where the democracy is in going to a centralised body that has no recourse and is in no way accountable to local communities. So when I say that the local democracy is taken out of it, as I say, a planner who works for Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council is obliged to answer a question from me in the council if I ask it. Nobody from An Bord Pleanala knows who I am, and if I ring up, I'm the same as anybody on the street, so I have none of that power of being an elected person with An Bord Pleanala. But Arthur makes the point about there being very strict guidelines, and there are, and he says there's a lot of public consultation around the formation of county development plans, and he's right, there is. But you now have a situation where An Bord Pleanala does not have to have regard to that. They can override the provisions, and they have. They can override the provisions of county development plans in all areas except zoning. So height strategies and densities and things like that can be overridden by An Bord Pleanala with these big applications. That's a problem. And exactly the point you make, Arthur, is that so much effort goes into the formation of these plans. There is so much consultation, and they're so carefully balanced to reflect what's needed. the fact that An Bord Pleanala can just ignore them is hugely problematic. And if I may, on one other point, Arthur refers to long-term living. We have to get used to the fact that apartments must become long-term living if we are to deal with the density issue of housing in Dublin. And I'm somebody who lived in Paris for a long time and worked and studied there. Apartment living in Paris, which is much more palatable than it is here, is very much aimed at long-term living, and there are lots of very old buildings there. But within a 3-bedroom apartment, for example, you will have 2 living rooms. You will have 2 living spaces. It's very difficult to bring up a family in a 3-bedroom apartment if there's 1 living room. And any parents listening will know how difficult that would be. So we have to move away from this model of small, pokey apartments where people live for a few years and recognise that they must become family dwellings.
Yeah, and actually, Barry, I completely agree with you that we do need to reconcile ourselves that in the future people will be living long term in apartments, but is that not all the more reason why we need to differentiate between our apartment stock, so that we're not using the same stock for rental as we are for long term purchase? Because actually what I need if I have a 3 children family is different to what I'd need when I'm a young professional and possibly sharing a room.
So you have a
that not the
smaller
argument?
apartment. If you're a single individual or 2 people sharing an apartment, you can have a smaller apartment. But what I'm saying is that I don't know, and I probably don't know as well as Arthur certainly, what the existing stock of apartments is around Dublin. But I do not know any 3-bedroom apartments that are not kind of expensive penthouses. 3-bedroom apartments in which you could raise a family. That come with a bit of outdoor space, maybe on a balcony or a roof garden or things like that. I live in an apartment. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment. It's not something, I mean, a couple could live there, but that's about the size of it. But the point I'm making is that we shouldn't be differentiating between let's say, rental stock and permanent stock, because otherwise you end up with whole buildings that are just rented apartments, and that creates its own problems of intransigence and other people who are not there with any permanence, and therefore they don't invest in their community or the property or anything like that. Maybe I've misunderstood what you said. But
no, I will actually. I no, you haven't misunderstood what I said. I actually do think that we do need to differentiate between our stock. I do think there should be different stock for long-term and short-term use, for rental and for ownership. And I say that having lived in France and in Spain and used apartments that were designed for families and for living. And you're absolutely right. We don't have 3-bed apartments here. And I think that going forward, the design of apartments needs to change. But I see that as being very clearly designated, that you would have apartments that are suitable for rental and apartments that are suitable for lifestyle. But you mentioned there about in the short-term nature of lettings. Actually, I think tenure is a problem with our rental system. I do think that we should be doing long-term rent. So actually, I do think that people should be able to access 3, 4, 5 year leases, and perhaps we need to consider terms longer than that.
There is a double-edged sword element to that, because we have to understand as well that if and I 100% agree with you, we need to expand the rights of tenants in order to ensure that people have security of tenure of apartments, but with that comes other responsibilities that will go on to tenants. And for example, the way the Residential Tenancies Board works at the moment is very much pro-tenant, and that's fine, but it makes it very unattractive for anybody to invest in being a commercial landlord. Now, there are companies doing it here, but the reality is that we would have to modify the way we deal with disputes between landlords and tenants, properly do that, rather than having an agency that appears to be somewhat one-sided.
Oh, I agree. I don't think we've ever had anybody on the show in the last 9 or 10 months that we're running. I don't think we've ever had anybody on the show that hasn't put forward that view that the Residential Tenancies Board, still there is the perception that it is pro-tenancy, even though obviously they would reject that. But again, that's almost making the argument why we're losing some of our private landlords and institutional landlords are taking their place.
I think I don't disagree with anything Barry said, and I think everything is right in what you're saying. But I think our housing stock now, the residential has become a much broader definition of housing stock now. Everything from hotels to apart hotels to student housing to private rental units to
say co-living.
I'm going to say co-living, co-living, shared living, whatever you want to call it, right down to apartments. And there are, I suppose co-living is our new one, and let's not go too much into that.
It's a controversial one.
Yeah, I can tell you all about that as well. It's fun. But for our apartments, we have very strict guidelines on size, and the new apartment guidelines that are national guidelines are excellent, and they've taken us from what we had in the Celtic Tiger, which were the little boxes, and we tried to squeeze them all into very livable units with very strict dimensions for size of kitchen, size of bedrooms, and very strict dimensions for storage, which is what every family needs. I've got 5 kids. I know all about storage, and so it's. I think all of that's fantastic, and I think there are lots of substandard apartments in town, and they're historical. I think all of the new apartments, and by that I mean pure apartments, and I have to go back to that big broad definition of residential, on the apartment side, where is what I call long-term living. If I'm going to live in that apartment, absolutely I need big, decent, generous apartments where I can rear a family, and we have standards for that, and the development plan sets out, if I'm building apartments, that I have to have exact standards for 2, 3, 1, 2 and 3 bedroom units, exact storage, open space, personal private open space, and they're quite decent and generous, and I think they do work, and you can raise a family in those buildings, and now we're going beyond that and putting amenity spaces into those buildings, which is beyond the kind of fixed open space, more into kind of social spaces, and those are lessons we're learning from Europe. And some of the best apartments I've seen are in South America, where they all live in apartments, and I've been on terraces with barbecues and fantastic apartments that a family would love to live in, and I think we're getting closer to that model in our pure apartment building, and I think they're out there, but we now have different types of almost person specification, and I use that word very carefully because I don't like to put people in boxes, but there are people who don't want that. There are people who don't want to live in a 3-bedroom semi, they don't want to cut the grass, they want to live in town, walking distance from where they're working, and all they want to do is, they're a young guy or young girl, they're going to sleep in that place, they're going to get up and go to work, and they're going to go socialise with their friends, and they've no real interest in property per se. It's a convenience to have it close to wherever, and they disappear for the weekends, and for those type of people, what they want in terms of a piece of property and a place to live is something completely different, and of course their budget is wholly different as well. And so the smaller, in inverted commas, apartments stroke living spaces for those people, I think is totally adequate, and I think we'll find that they'll become incredibly popular as time goes on, and they'll become much more affordable in the city centre. And I think you're right about the transient population. I don't expect a family to live in a 12 square metre or 14 square metres. It's not possible. It's impossible. It would be horrendous. But for me, from some of the rooms I lived in when I was a young kid in the city, going to college and growing up, if I had one of these rooms back then, I would have been, my God, fantastic. But we do need to go and control rents and stuff like that. I absolutely agree with that. Some of these things are becoming, hugely expensive to live in, and we need to make sure that the entire population can live in those types of developments. That's for sure. That's a whole different goalbent. It's not my bailiwick. I build these things, and we try to do some good stuff. But beyond that, the whole concept of student living, co-living, even the apart hotels, they're very much now about creating a social atmosphere for a population that is not a permanent population. It's a kind of semi-permanent and sometimes completely transient population. If you're building these things next to one of the big, international firms that all the kids work for, and they don't even need to cook when they come home. It's all provided for in these big large companies, and they're looking for that almost fun environment when they leave work that they have when they're at work, and it's completely different residential, and I understand why we're all reticent about it. We're all trying to understand this. We're all trying to, this amazing word called co-living. What is it? And in fairness, most of the councils that we've been to, and most of the planning departments, have been out into Europe and looked at co-living and looked at this. And I would say to you that certainly in Dublin City Council, most of the planners there know more about co-living than probably a lot of the architects in town, because they've purposely gone to look at it all. Because
Yeah. On the show so far, we've actually had a co-living special where we brought in some of the big operators, but we've actually we've just happened to cover co-living several times over the last few months, and it has been heavily criticised, but I, for one, actually am somebody who sees the benefits of it, but then I, for the last decade or more, would have been a proponent of the tiny house movement, the tiny home movement. You know, I think that we created these huge spaces that we didn't need, and we weren't using some of the social spaces that are around us. But I think one of the really important things to do, and because I always feel whenever we're having a conversation about co-living, you know, we need to keep it balanced, and that is, you know, this is not going to appeal to everyone. It's not designed to appeal to everybody. It's probably going to appeal to 1% of the population, and they're people who want the community, the low cost, and the convenience. That's it. So they're not looking to get into leases. So I think it's always really important that, you know, I don't like if there's a feeling that we're comparing, you know, apples with apples, because we're not. It's a different offering.
I think if you look at co-living, even all the co-living that's projected, I think you'll get nowhere near 1%. Nowhere near 1%.
Not even 1%.
Not even 1%.
It has its place, but I think you're right. It's a very small sector of the market. I think as well, I mean, as you're undoubtedly aware, there was a proposal for a co-living space in Dunleary with Barter Developments, and I must say I was not in favour of the application that they put in, and the disparity between the number of units, for example, and access to kitchens and things like that appalls me on a certain level. But at the same time, I think there was a dishonest appropriation of this issue by certain political groups within the council who absolutely misrepresented what was involved and absolutely put fear around this issue that was unjustified and unmerited, because, as you say, there is a place for this and nobody's forced to go into it. I think the prices are pretty steep, mind you, but that's a market force, and either they will be able to sustain that or they won't.
Yeah, now that's an interesting one, actually, because I believe there is a place for this, but likewise I would like to see it as a lower cost offering, but have a premium there if people want it. But I think that it should be a lower cost model, and obviously with a 20-year-old daughter, I think that something like this at a lower cost would be an ideal.
Well, it's interesting because I was speaking to a colleague on the council who lived in Chicago for a while in a co-living arrangement in Chicago, and I just asked him how much it cost, and it was I think $1,300, but per semester. He was in college, so that's half the year, you know. So the price point compared to what they're talking about for the Barter Development area, I think is €1,300 a month per unit, which is, I think, astronomical for what's involved. But I'd be very interested to see if the market will bear that kind of level.
I'd be interested to see when new players come into the market if there's going to be a price range, because I think like with everything in a hotel in Dublin, you can choose to stay somewhere for €89 or you can choose to stay somewhere for €489 per night. So I want to see when more operators come into the market, are we going to have that range?
And I think that will, just like the hotels you're talking about, will reflect in the quality of the product that you're getting, and
absolutely.
You know, I think we're in, as I said, a whole broad new world of the definition of residential, and I think we're exploring that, and I think anything new is expensive, and people, you know, I think that market will stabilise, and you know, things will come along. You know, look what Ryanair's done for aircraft, and for the better of all of us. You know, we all travel much more now because of Ryanair.
Yeah,
and that you know,
and that has to be a good thing.
Yeah.
Well,
although
not for climate change.
I was about to say,
we're on to a different story now. Yeah.
Okay, look, we're going to take a short break now. We'll be back to continue this conversation with Barry Ward, Fine Gael local councillor of Dunleary-Rathdown County Council, and Arthur Bryan, managing director of C&W O'Brien. And one of the things we're going to be discussing after the break is this concept of NIMBYism and the democratic right to get involved in the planning process. So join us after the break.
Everything's fine on 93.9 Dublin South FM.
Oh, will you look at them go? I wish I had their energy.
They're good for the soul, though, aren't they? I can't imagine life without Lucky. But he might outlive me yet.
Oh, well, take my advice and sign up for a Dogs Trust Canine Care card. It's completely free, and it's given me such peace of mind since I did.
What's that?
Well, it's simple, really. It means if you pass away before Lucky, Dogs Trust will take him in and give him the care and love he needs until they match him with the perfect forever home.
That sounds terrific. How much did you say it costs?
It doesn't cost a cent.
Great. How do I sign up?
Just text CARE to 50100 and they'll call you with more information. Or you can go to dogstrust.ie.
Well, that's wonderful advice. I'll do that right away. Here, Lucky. Good boy.
Whatever loan you're looking for, wedding loans, holiday loans, car or home improvement loans, make sure you talk to your local Capital Credit Union, where there are no hidden charges or early repayment penalties on your loan. Loans subject to approval, terms and conditions apply. Capital Credit Union Limited, regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland.
Senior Line is a confidential telephone service for older people. Free phone 1800 80 45 91. We're open every day of the year from 10 a.m. till 10 p.m, including Christmas Day and New Year. So it's free phone 1800 80 45 91. We're there if you need someone to talk to and need someone to listen. We're older people too, so we will understand, and we're very good at listening. Did you get the Senior Line number? It's free phone 1800 80 45 91.
Your community radio for South Dublin. This is Dublin South FM.
Okay, welcome back to Property Matters here in Dublin South FM with myself, Carol Tallon. In studio now, again, we're joined back again with Barry Ward, Fine Gael local councillor of Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council, and Arthur O'Brien, managing director of C&W O'Brien Architects. And we were talking about the democratic process being in some way thwarted. You feel, Barry?
I do, because I think, well, I mean, my own view actually is that there has been a centralisation of local authority powers generally, and councillors now have been reduced really to being local ambassadors to the executive of the local authority, and then on to the department, the relevant department, which I think renders the role of the councillor to be bad value for taxpayers locally, even though councillors are working very, very hard. The local voter and taxpayer does not get the value for money that he or she should, because councillors don't have the power to do what needs to be done very often. But the difficulty I have is when you centralise that power, when you take it away from local authorities and local communities by extension, you remove a democratic element of planning or other areas, which is really important. And
is it being removed because there's a public consultation element as part of developing the local area plan? Is that democracy being removed, or is it being, is it being put to the public at a different stage?
Well, I think it is being removed. I mean, you refer to local area plans, so as a council we have an overarching, I suppose, planning constitution, if you want to call it that, which is the county development plan or the city development plan in Dublin City. The county development plan is done every 5 to 6 years. We start the process again next January or February, I think, and that is the basic set of parameters that are supposed to govern all planning applications in the county. It deals with heights, it deals with densities, it deals with parkland, zoning, and in terms of building standards themselves, it can come down to define specific elements within them and objectives and goals for the local authority. The reality is now that with these strategic housing developments, they can, An Bord Pleanala, when they bypass the council, and Arthur has correctly said that they do have consultations with the council, but realistically the council planners don't get, if they disagree with the developers, to stamp their mark on it the way they would in an ordinary planning process. When it gets to An Bord Pleanala can decide, well, I don't care that Laoghaire-Rathdown County councillors have said that there shouldn't be buildings above 5 stories in this area, or that there shouldn't be above a certain density, whatever it is. They can overrule that. So we can talk about all the consultation we like about the process that goes into the development plan, which takes place over years, by the way, and involves hours and hours and hours of meetings of councillors and hours and hours and hours of officials' time in Laoghaire-Rathdown to collate responses and details and all that kind of thing. But ultimately it's for naught if An Bord Pleanala can just ignore it. Now they're banned by the zoning aspect. So if we say that is open space and that is residential development and that is industrial, whatever, they're banned by that. But they're not banned by things like height strategies or densities or things like that.
Okay, but Barry, I'm going to take you back a few months earlier when our Minister for Housing spoke about the approach he's taken and has taken from when he was given the brief of development, of planning. In fact, he said that he sought out this brief, and he said that he sought it out because he was not happy with decisions that he and his fellow councillors took as at the time of developing the local area or the local city plan for Dublin back in 2011. So this was one of the things that he wanted to do. He felt that there had been an arbitrary approach taken to height restrictions and even to densities in certain areas around the city.
Yeah. And I understand that, and Owen Murphy and I do not agree on this issue, and we've had this discussion several times, although I've great respect for him. He's obviously also coming from Dublin City Council background as opposed to my background, which is Laoghaire-Rathdown.
Should that matter?
Well, I think yes, it should, because ultimately Dublin City Council is dealing with a much denser area in terms of the population density than Laoghaire-Rathdown. I mean, you have farms in Laoghaire-Rathdown. There are no farms that I'm aware of anymore in Dublin City. I know that there was one until recently. There was a herd of dairy cows somewhere in Dublin City, but they have been sold. But like you do actually have agricultural land, particularly in Stepaside and Kiltiernan and places like that in Laoghaire-Rathdown. So it is different. We're a county council, they're a city council. But I think what he was referring to was a frustration with certain politicians who essentially are given a representation by a local community that they will not have X, Y or Z in a certain area, and rather than challenging the basis for that decision or arguing it out or taking a stance on an issue that they might really know is otherwise, the local politicians, because they're afraid of their electorate, will just go with something that might not be objectively justifiable.
No, absolutely. In fact, he used the term vested interest,
Yeah.
albeit well-intended.
Yes,
vested interest.
yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, and when you look, we have any number of communities and residents and things like that who come to us and say, "I'm very unhappy about this proposal for my area," and that is, of course, a legitimate concern. They are not doing so out of a pecuniary interest. They're doing so because they're concerned their area is going to change unrecognisably. I understand that. And I think there is a very important role for local councillors to engage with residents on that issue. And if they feel that they agree with the residents, then they should represent that view of the council and they should stand by it. But I know myself there are times when I've had to say to resident associations, look, I understand your concerns. However, I don't agree with you. And I don't think that's a justifiable concern. And there's any number of occasions where I have had to do that. It's uncomfortable because they're also the people you're seeking to represent on the council and whose votes you'll be asking for the next election. But I think it's an important thing, and it's something like as an elected representative, you must be true to your own beliefs when you stand up in the council and take a particular view. And in my experience, where I have said that to local resident associations, I don't agree with you, and I'm not going to support that. Ultimately, as far as I know, they have all worked out well, and ultimately you will have the respect of people for having stood by the principle rather than just going with the popular.
You know, I am happy to hear you say that, because actually one of the criticisms I have in terms of planning across the board is that actually there shouldn't be political involvement whatsoever, because the short-term lifespan of political appointees, and that's just the reality. You know, it's a little bit like I will no longer read biographies from anybody who still needs somebody to fall in love with them, to vote for them, or to buy something from them. That's my rule of thumb about biographies, and unfortunately politics falls into the same rule. You know,
or all three categories.
Or all three, you know, so I'm actually really happy to hear you say that, because actually it's quite refreshing. I haven't heard that too often. So Arthur, in terms of developments that you're dealing with, I mean, you know, the views of the public, the reality is people don't like change, and I don't want to brush that all or paint it all kind of with the NIMBY brush, because I don't think that's fair. But how cognizant are developers of sensitivities for local areas?
I think certainly nobody wants to upset anybody. There's no question about that. Everybody wants to try and work with their neighbour and be a good neighbour. I don't think there's any magic system, whether it's the SHD process, or the National Spatial Strategy, or the development plans that we see in every local authority. Nothing is perfect, and you know, sometimes we find ourselves cherry picking our way through. There are times when we'll play the National Development Plan, or we'll play the SHD card, and there's times we'll revert back to the local development plan. And you know, we have an instance. We've launched in the last couple of weeks a new residential development in Tullamore, probably the first one that's been built for 10 or 15 years. We chose to go directly to the local authority there because we knew we would get a lower density, which is the product that the local people wanted to have and live in, which are the houses, the long-term living, you know, fine sizes, great space and rooms and storage. We couldn't get that under the National Spatial Strategy. We couldn't get it if we went to the board. And our biggest fear is that we would be taken to the board and they would insist on a higher density, which was not the product for the area. You know, nothing's perfect, there's no question, but I think there is a democratic process there, and I think, you know, there's a time and as I've said before, that to participate in that process. Development plan, local area plans, they're highly politicised, and in a good way, because your local representatives are inputting into that, and that's no bad thing. But sometimes I think, we need to have a big brother watching over, because sometimes things can get too local. And I think in Dublin City Council, where especially on heights and densities and stuff, it's become a little bit too local. And we need to, I can go to Cork and build 25 stories. You can see the refusals along the docks recently for much, much less than that.
Okay, as you're bringing Cork into this is a good time to wrap up, because I think that's a whole other conversation. That's a whole other conversation for another day. And remember, all politics is local. So look, that was Barry Ward, Fianna Gael local councillor of Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council, Arthur O'Brien, managing director of C&W O'Brien Architects. Thank you both for joining us. That's it from us in studio today, and thank you to all of our guests. We urge people to get in touch on hello@iPropertyRadio or hello@iPropertyRadio or Twitter @iPropertyRadio. And again, I just want to thank everybody for being with us here today, and also thanks to Danny Hickey on sound. We're back at the same time next week. From myself, Carol Talon, have a great week.